As an entrepreneur, it's just really hard to not simply have the weight and awareness of how many plates you have to keep spinning. And some of them sometimes shouldn't be spun. Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. So here's my story. Last week, I had not one, but two mapping sessions with clients where we're sort of dumping our purses out proverbially of like an issue to kind of dig through it and sort through it and figure out where the snarl is, what's hanging them up. And both of them, very, very, very different situations, but both of them were I use that word snarl, but they were like drowning in the quicksand of all the things they were trying to think about. And at the end of the day, both of them needed this same kind of like separating the variables and thinking about it in the same way. So I just wanted to kind of surface it. And the interesting thing is it came down to time. So in my mind, it almost feels like this grid of like all the issues, what's important, sort of what things lead to what things. But then at the end of the day, the snarl was coming because they were thinking of things that are further down the decision tree that won't come up once they make some of the preliminary decisions. I know that sounds very vague, but it reminded me of a time when, and I may have told this story before on the podcast, but when I was talking to a cousin of mine about homeschooling, this before I had kids, and she was telling me how she did it, then, what she did. And I was like, well, I find it kind of interesting, but then I listed a bunch of things. I think I have told this story before. I listed a bunch of things like, well, I don't know if I'd really be the person to teach like advanced chemistry. And what about their social lives? And she has this very like droll, sarcastic face most of the time. And she looked at me and she's like, so let me get this straight. You are making a decision about homeschooling because of the high school years of children that you don't have yet in the marriage that you're not in yet. And you've decided homeschooling is out for you. I was like, okay, fair point. So it's a tiny bit like that. But the reason it felt important is in both cases, and then I'll get into some more of the details here. At the end of the conversation, this massive weight lifted because when you sort of spread a thing out in time, and we literally did that. We put a line down the line of like, okay, here's a decision point before that decision point and what comes after that decision point, because we slowly chunked it down to what's your first next step? What are the things that you have to worry about this week? Because after these other things happen, half this decision tree goes away. And the lightness that came out of both those sessions at the other end felt like a feeling that I think for a lot of people has been very elusive of late, because it was in the realm of sort of clarity. There felt like there was less uncertainty, which came with like a lightness and then an agility to be able to just focus. And also for one of them, and this was super important because she was also feeling really, really, really run down. And I could tell that no matter what, we had to find some space in there for renewal. But because she was focusing on all the stuff, it felt like that was impossible. And once we kind of smeared out all the tasks to not just consider importance, but also timeline, and some of them became really clearly not the first next things to worry about because they may or may not show up, she also felt like she could have some downtime and like take a day off and chill this week. Because next week, if one of those decisions comes out the way we think it is, she's going to need every bit of energy she has and then some, but it's not here yet. So does that make any sense? I felt like I just rambled. It does. One of my more rambly stories.
It does, but at the same time, I can see the spectrum that's on, because a lot of the conversations that I have with people are on the other side. In other words, because of COVID and how the world was turned upside down, and we're looking back at, I certainly am, at a year ago. So we're taping right now in the middle of February. And a year ago, we knew what was going to happen in March and in April because business was going to continue. And of course, schools were in session and the world was just going to continue, and it was just the weather was just going to get warmer. We go into spring, and the NBA season was in full swing, and everything was going. And then things came to an abrupt halt. As a matter of fact, for my office, as I've mentioned, March 17th was the date of shutdown.
What's really funny? I wonder if how many people know their date. Ours was March 4th. March 4th was the day we sent my mother-in-law to not come over to our house to do the stuff she does with the kids each week, like March 4th.
Oh, I bet people know their date, and one of the big things was when the NBA canceled the season. We're like, that's serious.
Yeah.
But so I've had conversations with people where I've been trying to say, okay, well, let's plan farther down. And they're like, well, look, if this past year has taught me anything, it's that, you never know what's going to happen.
Oh.
And we have no idea.
So like a planning apathy almost.
Yeah. There's like, well, what's the expression? Man plans, God laughs. And so I've noticed when talking to people about, they start to talk to me about how they're going to arrange their offices as far as, OSHA protocols and masking and social distancing and what they have to do in terms of reporting. And sometimes even before they finish the question, they're like, yeah, but then again, nobody ever knows what's going to happen. So it's probably not worth talking. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, because the world's going to look a lot different in 4 weeks than it does right now. And there's some merit to that.
Right. Well, so that's interesting. Like so many things in the world, I feel like it's almost like whichever thing you're more apt to do, you have to think about the other one. So in those cases, it's like if you're being completely planning, like if you have planning apathy or whatever you want to call it, then it might be useful to be a little bit more, how can I use this time, to rev up a tiny bit in what can I plan on or work on? Or if that's not the case, then where can I create, benefit or forward movement in the organization? If I can't plan that, what can I do? Whatever. In this case, I think maybe that sort of does lay out this continuum when overwhelm is looming, when it feels like there's almost too much to think about to get your bearings. That's when I think this kind of decision mental framework is really useful, because in both of the sessions, I kept using and I think this is a really apt metaphor of, if you have a home, if you're going to put it on the market next week, then that changes, if that sells in 2 weeks, I'll say, like, that changes conversations about whether you're doing an addition. Or now it doesn't change conversations about, so sorting this thing in. That's why, like, really laying out the decision matrix of it. Like, okay, no matter what, whether we sell the house or whether we stay here, we have to fix that broken brick on the front walk, because someone, including us, will trip over it. And no matter what, we have to fix that. So that gets to stay in the category of things that I worry about. But if you sell the house and you've been thinking about, I don't know, putting in a pool, so sitting in today and trying to plan for both who would be my pool contractor and getting the house on the market, that has a risk of wasted energy. So you take the pool piece and you break that down into tiny little bits of things of, like, is there any risk to waiting? If I put it over in this, it doesn't need my immediate attention category so that I can prioritize the things that do. Is there any risk to that? Well, you have to get on a pool person's, if we do stay here and I do put on a pool, I have to get on that 6 months in advance. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just get on somebody's calendar in case that happens. But then I put it in this not right now category. And so it's using time. It's a little bit tricky because every entrepreneur, every leader we talk about this often, has to like look out and predict the future a little bit, think about the future, plan where you're going. You can't just look at your feet and take the step right in front of you. But in cases of either overwhelm or just wanting to get really clear and focused priorities so that you are using your time in like a laser focused, effective way, this discerning what part of that, where am I crossing a bridge that I haven't come to yet and may not come to if this other thing happens.
So it sounds like you're placing things into one of two baskets. And I could be wildly wrong on this, but what my takeaway is that one basket is short term, the stuff that we have to do now, and we just have to get that done. So that's one line. The other seems to be almost a basket that's outcome agnostic. meaning that if it's, we only have to make this decision if the outcome is that we're selling our house. We only have to make this decision if we're whatever. But outcome agnostic is whether we're selling our house or whether we're just going to live here, we still have to fix the brick in the front walkway. So that's whether you call it outcome agnostic or planning agnostic. There are certain things that you're just going to have to do.
Right. And those get to stay in your attention. I think the real value is, and the reason the metaphor of the house came up in one of them was they were talking about an acquisition. There's a potential acquisition on the table, them being acquired. So, and here's the key thing, they'll find out some key things about, they won't know for sure if it happens, because obviously those processes take quite a long time to kind of, and at any moment it could end. But they would get it if there was going to be a definitive thanks, but no thanks. They'll know that in like a week or two. And so, and if that happens, if they get, there was a big conversation that could be a, nope, thanks, we're not interested. So if that happens, then there's all this stuff that they really need to be doing for the company, for the bigger picture stuff and whatnot. But if that is going forward, it would be pretty foolish to be investing a ton of either financial or energetic resources into some things that you really, again, if I'm putting my house on the market and, in 2 weeks, am I going to replace the electrical system? And again, that's where you have to make this differentiation. If there's a fire risk, then yes. But if we're talking about, I just want a better electrical system, it reminded me too when we bought my Prius many, many, many years ago. We had no intentions of buying it that day. It's just when Priuses, I think so. Priuses had just come out, and you couldn't test drive them. You had to order them, and they would come in like 6 months. And I didn't like the idea of buying a car I'd never even, sat in or driven around or something. And there was a lightly used one at a car dealership, like down in Severna Park or something. So we drove down there just so I could drive it around and then decide if we wanted to order one. And it ended up being a great deal. We ended up buying the car that day. But hysterically, we traded in my Xterra, which is a big SUV kind of thing. And as we were driving away, I turned and looked at it and I was like, because I had just 4 days before that put expensive brand new tires on my SUV. And they were so new that they still had the white writing on them, like that had not worn off yet. And my parents had the exact same car. And had we thought it through a tiny bit, I would have taken them somewhere, bought cheap tires, swapped them out, given those tires to my parents or whatever. And certainly, and this is more to the point, had I known I was going to buy a car, that Prius, I never, ever, ever would have spent the money I did on those expensive snow tire, So it was that kind of feeling of if you are going to be acquired, this thing that you're trying to cram into this week when you are exhausted is not going to be a priority anymore. And they were also going to have to commit to a big contract with this vendor to put this stuff into play. And I'm like, why would you, in a week, you're going to find out this one thing that may make that entire work and investment of money as well and commitment to a contract obsolete, because that won't be your thing anymore. And as she could see that easily once we laid it all out. But when it was all one big blur and all she could see was, here's everything I have to worry about and think about and all the plates I have to keep spinning. Maybe that's it. As an entrepreneur, it's just really hard to not simply have the weight and awareness of how many plates you have to keep spinning. And some of them sometimes shouldn't be spun. You should take them off the needle pokey stick thing, whatever that is in a plate spinning.
No, that's right. The needle pokey stick.
The needle pokey stick thing, and set it down for a minute, because it's not, spinning it right now is actually not strategic.
Yeah, I think that when you use the word strategic, you go back to thinking about, all right, but if we've set our goal of being acquired, there are things that we should be doing a year before we're going to put our company on the blocks. So if they were approached sort of unexpectedly. So it was kind of like someone knocking on their door and saying, hey, we'd like to buy your house. but there's a, this is the second time I've referenced this, and it's probably to the wrong audience, but second time in a week. But so in Marvel, I think it was Infinity War. which I know you're very conversant with. There's a scene where one of the characters, Dr. Strange, is sitting there and he's just fixated. And somebody's like, well, what's wrong with him? And what he was doing was he was going through all of the possible outcomes of this war that they were having with Thanos. And he could see different timelines. That's one of his abilities. And he went through, over 1 million different timelines. And you could see him just going back and forth and in, they won in one timeline. That was only one timeline. But what's interesting to me, and the image that I had when you were talking about the consultations you had with your clients, is there's an image of Dr. Strange sitting there and his head is just reverberating back and forth as he's trying to see all of these different timelines. And you could see the paralysis because he's perfectly still.
Yes.
He's not doing anything. And people were looking over at him because he should have been doing things at that moment. And they're looking over saying, what's wrong with him? And that's where I see a lot of business people and how I imagine your clients were, because they had a lot going on in their head, more than other people who were observing them would have going on in their head. But they seemed to be motionless and almost paralyzed because they were trying to gauge so many different timelines that they weren't moving in one of them.
Right. And it was all the more weighty in the one call where what was just undeniably important was some time for some rest. And interestingly, that person ended up a few days later sick for a few days, and not because I think that's why they were feeling the way they were doing, is they were working up to a bug of some sort. And it felt impossible. At the beginning of the call, that client wouldn't even entertain the concept of finding some downtime because all of this felt so weighty and so impossible to not address, because it all felt super, super important. And that's the interesting thing. All those things are super, super, super important. And they are, it adds like another dimension to that important, urgent quadrant, because I'm not talking about urgency. Like when I lay in a timeline, it's not urgency. It's almost, because it's not just that it comes later, because a lot of times things that come later will still need your attention, but it's saying like, well, we might not get to that point. Like until that's here, like we can't put energy into that. We have to be cautious of how much energy we pour into a thing that may end up not even being a thing because this other thing takes it in another direction. It's a weird metaphor to use, but it reminds me a tiny bit when I was talking with someone who was not a client, but who had someone very dear to them who had had a biopsy for potential cancer. And, it's very fair and very normal to be very worried and stressed. And so I'm not saying that, but this person was kind of being consumed by that worry and concern. It was like taking over everything. And so we had this interesting conversation about, if we're not there yet, it may be nothing. And if that comes up, if that is what's happening, then you're going to need all your energy for that, because there's going to be a lot to deal with. And so being, again, not saying don't have those emotions, because it's totally natural. I sound like a cold-hearted jerk. Be like, no, it doesn't matter yet. You don't know anything. But just being conscious of like, is that, how much do I take that emotion for a ride if it's not yet here?
Well, the one thing that I come back to though is, and you've used this, I think you've said, it's really difficult to read the label from inside the bottle.
I have never said that, but I love that.
Well, it's not original to me, so I don't know.
So you just assumed it was me?
Well, I assumed it was you because, it was eloquent and wise, and it reverberated with me. So it resonated with me. So yeah.
You're being awfully nice today.
I'm off my meds.
That was like a compliment.
So
wow.
I can give them.
You just can't take them.
So, but what struck me about, what you were describing, not only with your clients, obviously, but the mindset that they're in, is that I don't think that they'd be able to arrive at any kind of peace or recognize the issue, let alone arrive at some sort of quote unquote treatment plan, meaning, the recognition that this is not something I need to focus on or dial this down, or that I'm looking too far down the decision tree. In the absence of somebody who's outside the bottle, of somebody who is, whether it's a coach or a mentor. And it strikes me because we started the podcast talking about how lonely running a business can be. And this is really one of the main examples of how that comes home.
Yeah.
Because who do you talk to about all of the things down the decision tree and what you're working on? I don't think that it's a great idea to talk to all of your employees about the fact that you're paralyzed into inaction because of the different decision points. Maybe you have some people in a management team to do that, but a lot of times you need somebody who's on the outside.
For sure. I mean, that's why I stopped using the term coach as much, because instead calling it like on-call decision support or whatever we call it, because that is what, and this is what you do with your empty hourglass, is people just need to have someone to bounce a thing off of. And it's so interesting because there's two things that I think it's so important about this. Is part of it's having someone else, because it's like you said, from inside the bottle, or watching someone else parallel park a car. But there's another piece to it, which I also kind of noticed last week, is when you can have someone else help you walk through and then feel confident about setting that thing aside, because you now, like, the invisible has been made visible and now you can see it. And now your rational brain has been validated that it's the right path. Two really important things happen. It gets you out of paralysis. So it gives you the confidence, or in some cases, the courage, or whatever it is, with the clarity to get out of paralysis and take action. And that's super important. Very rarely is paralysis a valuable place for an entrepreneur to sit. And interestingly,
doesn't really give you much.
Right. But what's super important about that, and why it's not always so clear, is sometimes, and this sounds like almost an oxymoron, sometimes the action that needs to be taken is rest, but that's still different than paralysis, than sitting there churning and wasting energy on the paralysis of trying to, spin all these different plates. But it also does another really important thing I've noticed, which is you take that action, you do that thing, even if it doesn't work out perfectly, like it wasn't the exact right decision or exact right thing or whatever. Having had another person validate and create that is almost like a backstop. I always think of those video games, the big difference in video games, where some, if you die, you go all the way back to the beginning, no matter how far you've come. And others, you have these sort of backstop level ups, where if you die, you don't go all the way to the beginning. You just go back to the, this last little bit. And it does that. And that, to me, I think that's part of why you can have the confidence to get out of paralysis and take a step, is because that validation just doesn't throw you all the way back into the quicksand of like, oh, I knew that was, I should have thought that through more. I should have stayed in paralysis longer and really thought about it and spent a bunch of more time and energy on it. It's like, no. That decision was good enough. It had value as it was. And yeah, it didn't turn out the way I thought it would, or I didn't get quite the reaction from that person that I thought I would, but then you can navigate from there. So it's also not an energy drain.
No, and I think there's a big difference between paralysis and intentional inaction. To be intentional about it. But I do think we go back to having that outside influence, the ability to, whether it's have a backstop or the ability to have somebody call you on the spirals that we all go down. And I've noticed that a lot of business people I talk to, particularly when they're new, starting out, or they think that they should have all the answers, they just don't seek out that person or that group until it's forced upon them by probably the same paralysis you've encountered.
Well, that's why it's funny. I have a new marketing person working with me, and we're working on like putting frameworks around this concept of decision support, or whatever we decide to call it, for that very reason. Is wanting to make that more of a, it's not hiring a coach, it's not hiring a consultant, it's not getting a therapist or joining like something big and commitment. It's just creating more spaces, and it doesn't even have to be me or you. It's not about some guru you're going to. It's just finding some place where someone can understand your things, ask good questions, point out things that they, challenge some things, but then also not be so committed to their perspective that then you're having to fight with them. You're like, oh, no, here's my side. You're like, oh, okay, now I see why you're doing that. Just so that you can find that, what I think of as actionable clarity, so that you're not stuck in paralysis.
That should be the name of the episode, Actionable Clarity.
Ding.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories. You can find links to that group, as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email, and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.